Welcome to another episode of Building Up Your Business, the podcast. Remember, from bombs to order fulfillment, marketing to taxes, learn the stuff from the pros before you step in it. Today is another great episode. We have been talking a lot about mitigating risk, and today we're joined by David Gering. Not only having a background in communication and crisis public relations, David has 18 years of experience performing business continuity management in manufacturing and high technology. This includes 10 years at Nestle USA. Now, as a principal of Business Resilience Solutions, he helps organizations to plan to better recover from a major disruption to operations. This equips organizations to recover their priority production and operations faster and more efficiently. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Thank you, Erica.
Of course. My name is Erica with Operationally Up. We're here to help your consumer goods and e-commerce business to operate more efficiently and effectively. So we've been talking a lot about risk and mitigating risk. Last episode, we talked about how insurance can help mitigate manufacturing risk. And there's been a couple of other posts about crisis public relations, and this is a great episode for us to focus in on. As we've been hearing on the news, there's a lot of devastation in David and I's dearest city, Los Angeles, with the fires that have been ravaging through LA, and they've taken out countless businesses. And while there's many things that you can do, one of the big things is about having a business recovery plan to help these businesses get back. Some of these things are heartbreaking. A lot of them are heartbreaking, and our thoughts go out to all of the businesses that have been interrupted. But today we want to focus on how do you prepare for something that could be tragic and detrimental to your business. And that's why David is here to discuss how to approach a disaster like a pro. So, David, let's start by explaining what a business recovery plan really is.
Sure. A business recovery plan is a roadmap. It's there to guide people who already know how to do their day job, but it's to help them through a time when they're not able to do their day jobs as normal. It's when things are not normal in any way, shape, or form. And so people need to have that guidance in order for them to know what to do in the right order at the right time, so that they are pulling in the same direction, because you've got teams of people. They all have to be able to work together. They all have to be working towards the same priorities. And having a business recovery plan helps them in advance to set those priorities, gain the agreement amongst the team as to what they're really going to do, to be able to resume certain operations, resume certain production, resume certain ways of doing business that are specific to them, so that they can deliver on those priorities in a timely fashion. Look, everybody knows how to do their job, and a business recovery plan is not there to document how to do their job. It's there to help them avoid having things falling through the cracks. And falling through the cracks is something that happens when people are under stress, when they're overtired, when they have competing crises happening. The business recovery plan is there to be a tool for everybody to take them through the process from start to getting back to resuming operations as normal. Because from the moment a crisis occurs to the moment that they're able to resume normal operations, that period is called recovery, and that's why it's a business recovery plan. Everything that happens between those two milestones has to be thought through in advance in order for people to be efficient and effective.
Well, and when they're in the right state of mind to be thinking through these things, because
Exactly.
I'm sure that when these things happen, you're not thinking as straight as you would. So by
No.
having that done ahead of time, you can think through what is right, which actually kind of leads me into my next question. Tell us a little bit more about why having this plan thought through ahead of time is so important.
Well, like I said, you have to have your priorities straight. If you have to first sit down and figure out after an event has occurred what you're going to do, what's your priorities for recovery, that's too late. Everybody needs to think that through rationally when they have the luxury of time to do that. That's the first thing. The next thing is all of those things that can be done prior to an event that will actually mitigate the effects of the whatever the event is. There are things that businesses can and should do in advance when things are normal, so that when things aren't normal, they're going to be better prepared.
Yeah.
What do I mean by that? It could mean having excess inventory in place so that you can eat into that inventory until you can resume production. It means having key equipment and supplies in place so that you're going to be able to operate if a supplier is not available to you. It means that you're cross-training people so that if you have a shortage of your team because they can't come to work or they're not able to work for whatever reason, you've got cross-training in place so that these people can be covered for. Not replaced, but can be covered for until they can come back to work. And that cross training is very valuable under normal circumstances from day to day. If somebody's out sick, somebody else has to be able to pick up and do what needs to get done. So some of these things that are mitigations are actually, they're strategic decisions that are going to actually help the business on a day-to-day basis. One of the other things that I would recommend is that people pre-qualify additional vendors and
Yeah.
suppliers. Because for a lot of companies, especially big corporations, that pre-qualification process takes time. It takes sometimes months, and there's a lot involved in that. If companies take the time to do that, when they have the luxury of time to do that, they're going to be ahead of the game, because when an event occurs and a supplier is unable to deliver, you've got another one already in the wings, ready to go. Now, ideally, you'd be working with that supplier and you give them 10 or 20% of your total need so that they are in the works. They're actually doing the work for you on a routine basis so that you know that they can deliver, number one. They can deliver the quality, they can deliver the quantity, and they can be available to scale up if they need to. All of those things, that's just good business.
Yeah.
That's just the better way of doing business on a day-to-day basis. It's not just to prepare for an event.
Well, and you and I were actually just talking about that the other day because I've run into a lot of different companies who are like, "Oh, but we have, really good relationships with our core vendors and, we don't want to disrupt this trust." And it's not about trust. It's about having to be prepared, and giving 10 or 20% to somebody else isn't saying that your core vendor is bad at their job or that you don't trust them, but things happen and you have to be prepared for that. I use the example of UPS versus FedEx. In all of the
Absolutely.
companies that I've worked in, we've always used both. You may have one that you give the majority of your business to, but you're set up and ready to go because there have been disruptions where we've had to flip the switch and say, well, now we're shipping all with X because something happened with Y. And so there's that mental thing of having to get over that you're breaking trust or being disrespectful, and it's really hard for companies.
And I understand that. But you know what? These are business decisions.
Yeah.
Obviously, a company may have a good working relationship with a vendor, and that's wonderful and it's very valuable in and of itself. But if it's that good a relationship, the vendor is going to understand that what you're trying to do is to make sure that there's a continuity in place. And frankly, I would think that they would be appreciative of the fact that you're doing what you can to ensure that the business can continue to operate so that when that vendor number one can come back online, that you're going to still be there to buy from them.
Yeah.
And the only way you can do that is to ensure that you can get the supplies and equipment and the products that you need for you to run your business. And it's just good business to have multiple suppliers. Uh, and preferential pricing from one supplier because you're exclusive. I get that exclusivity. I get it. Yeah. Companies have to factor that into the business, that they may not have quite the best price from a supplier if they're not exclusive. But in the long run, it's money well spent to pay
Yeah.
a little bit more just so that you don't have that exclusivity pricing. Because when an event occurs and you don't have another supplier online, that's even more costly.
Well, and the funny thing that I like to kind of equate it to is diversity in customers. So that vendor that you're working with, if you're giving them all of your business, you are not their own customer. They have multiple customers because if something happens to one customer, they still have business from other customers and they're not going to go out of business. So it's the
Sure.
same thing as having multiple vendors is you're protecting yourself the way they're protecting themselves. It's just in reverse.
Yeah, uh, absolutely correct. And I would add that in addition to the concern about the exclusivity, companies need to understand that they need to build resilience into the operating model, the business model. And if they communicate that to their vendors and the vendors understand where they're coming from, they're going to be in a lot better place in the long run. And the vendors, I think, will respect it.
Yeah, I agree with you. So, kind of going back to our initial question about the importance of, having a business recovery plan in place, we were talking about the stress. Can you talk a little bit more about the type of mindset that you have ahead of time versus during or after a major event?
Sure. First of all, I think both of us being Angelinos, I think we need to acknowledge the fact that what has happened in the month of January in Southern California is unprecedented,
Yeah.
and it has created disaster fatigue, frankly, for a lot of
Mm,
people. News fatigue, disaster fatigue, but I need to emphasize for those people listening in Southern California, this is the most important thing you can do right now is to look at your planning, look at your business resilience with fresh eyes, understanding what you've just gone through, and recognize that this is the best time to start thinking about this in concrete terms. And you're right, there is a certain mindset before an event occurs and a separate mindset once an event occurs. And when an event occurs, people get a lot less smart. Their ability to think through things, to be strategic thinkers, strategic problem solvers, that goes out the window.
yeah.
The hope is that when you have the luxury of time before an event occurs. Yes, you're busy with your day-to-day work. Everybody's got their day jobs, but if you think through these things in advance and get agreement amongst your team about what you're going to do, because that's important too. So everybody's pulling in the same direction when a time comes. But if you think this stuff through in advance, you're going to have better decision making, number one. And number two, that's the time to make the strategic calls. That's the time to say, if this is the kind of conditions we're dealing with, this is how we're going to operate. Making those decisions on the fly during an event, they're not going to be the best decisions. And even under the best of circumstances, after an event occurs like these fires, they're not working with a full deck of information. They're working with ambiguity, they're working in uncertainty. Making decisions with that in that kind of an environment, it's just not going to be as effective.
Yeah.
It's just a bit more of a crapshoot that way. I think that business in the long run is going to be a lot better served if they have a plan in place. And when I say a plan, by the way, Erica, I'm not talking about this huge 3-ring binder that's going to sit there gathering dust or serve as a doorstop for somebody's office. I'm talking about a very practical document that people can pick up, flip to the page, look at a checklist, and see what they need to do. And the checklist will guide them through not how to do their jobs, but how to respond to the event itself. There's a
Let's
difference.
I really love that you brought that up right now. Let's talk about that. What types of things should be in that resilience plan? You talk about a simple checklist. Like, what types of things should people be thinking about to include?
Okay, good question. The plans that I work with clients to develop, they start with, for each department, they have their own strategies as to what they would do depending on the kind of event that occurs. And by the way, when I sit down to work with clients to build plans, I'm not building a separate plan for a fire, a separate plan for an earthquake, a separate plan for an explosion, a separate plan for a pandemic, a separate plan for a supply chain disruption. What I do is create a plan that deals with 3 impact scenarios, and only
Mm,
those 3. The first is a loss of systems and data. The second is a loss of qualified trained personnel.
okay.
And the third is a loss of uh, a location or asset.
Hmm.
If people have a plan to address those 3 impact scenarios, they can pretty much address any event because they'll have the steps in place to be able to do what they need to do. So, take the systems and data uh, portion of a checklist. Hopefully, they will have data that's backed up that they can recover from, that they can bring back into the business. Hopefully, in this day and age, hopefully it's from the cloud.
Right.
Hopefully, they're not storing data in hard drives off-site. That's really not an efficient and effective way of doing things. If they have a system issue, then hopefully they have an agreement with a vendor so that they can get replacement equipment. Um, you know, companies still have computer rooms. They still have uh, operations that they need to have to support their operations on site. Fine. But make sure that you have the ability of getting new hardware quickly so that you have the hardware and the data to be able to address a loss. If it's a matter of personnel, if people can't come to work, or they are too ill to come to work, or you've lost people because of a regional event, you have to figure out what you're going to do, first of all, to support the people that can come to work,
Mm,
but who have been dealing with the emergency personally. Think of a hurricane. A hurricane is going to destroy a lot of a town. People are going to need to still be able to have a roof over their heads. They're going to need to have power and heat. They're going to need to be able to get access to food and water. Their families need to be cared for. Your employees will not come to work unless they feel safe to do so. So a company needs to think through what they're going to do to support their employees that can come to work so that they're going to have a workforce after an event occurs. Um,
like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, making sure those
yeah,
needs are taken care of so that they can perform.
exactly, exactly. Um, and then when you're talking about building workplace or asset loss, that's something that's really important because people need to first stabilize the physical building to make sure that it's safe or to cordon it off so that nobody goes in. One of the biggest problems after an emergency occurs is people start taking mental shortcuts. They
Mm.
start assuming that other people know what they know, and that's very often not the case. And then what
Interesting.
happens is people walk into a building where the roof is unsafe, and the next thing you know, you've got more injuries. You don't want that. So, with the building, workplace, or asset section of the plan, the checklist, one of the things you're going to do is to ensure that the building is secured one way or the other. And then from there, you're going to be talking about what vendors do you need to come in and deal with roof repair or wall repair or replacing production equipment, any of those things. The checklist is going to remind you of what you need to do, when you need to do it, and it will give you a list of vendors. The plan itself will have a list of vendors that you already have relationships with so that anybody who picks up that plan is going to know where to go to get what they need. And they don't have to go start hunting around somebody's desk to find
Mm.
that information. It's all in one place, in one document that everybody has access to.
Yeah, I love that. Well, and I was thinking about as you were saying, I love that point of everybody assumes that people know what you know. And until you said it, it didn't dawn on me, but that's so true in that example of the roof is compromised, it might be a common sense situation of like, well, of course the roof is compromised, but others may not have any of that background information. And if you can't communicate that or show that that's the case, you could have a way worse situation on your hands.
Yeah.
And that's a perfect example of being able to strategically think through things before you get to that event because I probably would have done that exact situation.
Yeah, emergency procedures are important as a foundation for getting to when you can go to business recovery. Let's be clear. A business recovery plan can't even be implemented until you stabilize the crisis. If God forbid you've had an active shooter situation,
Mm.
you're not going to do any business recovery until you have made sure that the threat has been neutralized, that the people who've been injured or killed are taken care of one way or the other, and that the building is now considered safe to re-enter. Nothing else can be done in that regard. Now, same for an earthquake. If a region suffers a major earthquake, nothing can be done for business recovery until that building is deemed safe to enter.
Yeah.
And until that happens, and it could be hours, days, or sometimes weeks. I don't know about you, Erica, but I've lived through all of the major earthquakes in Southern California. I was here when they happened, and I can tell you that in some cases it was weeks before buildings were considered safe to re enter. And that's
Well, they
just
got to
one
get
example.
inspected, and there's only so many people who can deem them safe in a certain territory. So,
Exactly.
I
Exactly.
mean, that makes sense.
Yeah.
The other thing that I love that you pointed out was that you boil it down to three categories. Because in my mind, when we're thinking business recovery, I go through that long list of things that a company could go through. And it's like, how do you plan for all of these different scenarios, but boil it down to three specific categories, and all of those plans will fall through it. And I started to go through a list in my head really quickly of like, oh yeah, that would fall into this category, and this, you know, would go like you talked about an active shooter, that would go into a certain category. Like it all makes sense, and I think that makes it a lot easier for companies to prepare for than having to think through those individual scenarios.
Yeah. And there's another aspect to an emergency that requires business recovery, and that is there's a precipitating event, there's the individual event, but Usually what happens in a crisis is there are follow-on events that occur. So you may have one impact scenario occur initially, but then pretty quickly after that you realize you have another impact scenario you're going to have to cope with in addition.
Yeah.
So, for instance, you could have a building explosion. Well, that's a building, workplace, or asset scenario. But then you find out there were people who were injured or killed, some of them key people. Well, then you've got a personnel issue.
Yeah.
And, at some point you might discover, well, oh, by the way, a lot of the cabling from the computer room ran through the building that was exploded. And then you've got a systems and data issue. So these are things that can occur that in waves, and it's not one discrete event that you're going to have to cope with. So, for instance, when I conduct a tabletop exercise simulation for a client after they've built their plan, the scenario starts with something, but then I give them waves of injects of things that have followed on with the initial event to complicate the process, because my goal with that exercise, number one, is to find holes in the plan so
Yeah.
that they can be fixed. But just as important, it's to give people experience using their plan
Hmm.
and then also experience working together in a new way. Because you can have a leadership team that works fine on a normal day-to-day basis, but in a live event, they're going to have to work in different ways. They're going to have to be able to communicate in different ways, and they're going to need to stay mindful of the important stuff. And the plan is going to help them stay on track. And it's very important for them to gain that experience in an intense 4 or 5 hour simulation where it's safe, but they gain that experience. And I've had clients tell me, it was great that we had a plan, but it was even better that we exercised that plan before we had this live event occur. And I've had people say that.
Oh, that's
So
great.
it does help a lot for people to understand how to use their plan, not just put it on a shelf after they're done with it.
Not just make a piece of paper and put it somewhere. Well,
Yeah.
and we all go when we go into fight or flight mode, we all go into that lizard brain and we go and everybody acts differently. Some people run around like chickens with their heads cut off. Some can actually, you know, tactically start to do things, but you never really know which way your team members are going to go. So that's a fantastic exercise to go through just
Yeah.
to see how people act.
I'm sorry, one of the other
Mm,
things people learn from this is that if they are not careful, they can make things worse.
yeah.
If they're not careful, they can actually do the wrong thing that could actually make things worse. And it's unfortunate to see, but it does happen. And the goal of the plan is to help them to avoid that kind of thing.
Well, and I would assume that it's very easy to make things worse. Even though you have good intentions, taking one wrong step, I think back to what we were talking about with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If something happens and it's devastating to somebody's family or personal life, for example, going through the fires here in LA, if you're not sensitive to the fact that you have team members who may have lost their homes, you could be losing workforce. And like you said, now you're going into another um, level of needing a business resiliency plan because you just lost your personnel. And that was a misstep of not being sensitive to what your team members are going through. So I think that that's a really important thing to make sure that you're not making it worse with just a very simple misstep.
Yeah, and I mean, let's be honest, it's good business to build goodwill with your employees by showing sensitivity and doing what you can to support them emotionally, financially, Reassure them that they're going to have a job if they have to take time off to deal with
Yeah.
losing a house and all their belongings. Reassure them that they can come back to their jobs. Very important. But in the meantime, with them not there, you have to figure out how you're going to still get their work done.
How are you going to
A
do that?
business recovery plan should be in place that does that.
Well, and the other thing that I want to address, I mean, we're talking about some very tragic situations, earthquakes, fires, workplace violence. But earlier we had talked about, if a vendor has a situation and you lose a vendor. So these business, resiliency plans are for a wide range of situations, not just
Absolutely.
these horrific, tragic, but for simple things like you talked about, loss of equipment in a computer room, and that could be something like a power surge takes out, a couple of servers or things. So there's people need to not go to these horrific situations, but they could be very simple situations that, if not handled correctly, could lead to more trouble and situations.
And let's talk about systems and data for a second. There's another scenario that everybody is thinking about periodically, and that is cyber.
Yeah.
Cyber events can break down into a couple different types, but the bottom line is if you have a business recovery plan in place, presumably that will include what you would do in the event of a cyber attack or a ransomware attack or something along those lines. Now, it happens again. This is another example of having a business recovery plan being good business. The reality is, in this day and age, if you are looking to buy cyber insurance, you have to be able to prove you have a plan in place and that you put in mitigations to reduce the likelihood that you're going to have a cyber event. Because the underwriters want to see that before they will talk about your insurance. And if you have one, you'll probably get preferential premiums. If you
Interesting.
don't have a plan, you may get underwritten, but at a much higher premium. These
Well,
are things that are happening now.
I think you were mentioning that the other day about how there has been an uptick in your business in writing these cybersecurity recovery plans because people were using them specifically to get better rates for their insurance. That's
Absolutely.
that's a very interesting kind of a new thing that we're starting to see and develop, especially as cybersecurity insurance becomes a more desirable asset.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, this has been incredibly educational, and I'm sure it's been a wide range of knowledge for people who and businesses who probably don't have a recovery plan in place. And it's given some great steps about how they can try to attack one. Of course, it's always best to have a partner when you're doing it and trying not to do it all yourself. So, people can try to take a hack at it, but the professionals know what they're doing. So thank you for sharing your knowledge with us, David. It's been a sheer pleasure.
Thank you.
And if you want to get in touch with David or you have any other questions about building a business recovery plan, we will put his contact information in the description of this episode. So feel free to reach out. His website and his email address will be there. Thank you again for joining us on another episode of Building Up Your Business. It has been educational, and we will see you back here in 2 weeks. So remember, from bombs to order fulfillment, from marketing to taxes, learn the stuff from the pros before you step in it. I've been your host, Erica Dill with Operationally Up. Please join us again, and we'll see you soon.